Hello, everyone, and welcome to Black Reconstructions, Cities, and Spatial Justice, a co-created event between MoMA and the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective. This is a timely public conversation coming off of the heels of a new groundbreaking exhibition at MoMA entitled Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. If you haven't checked it out, please do before it ends May 31st. This is going to be a powerful conversation amongst Black vanguards, many of whose work is included in the exhibition, and all of you. My name is Ifeoma Ebo, and I am a founding board member of the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective and founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, where I consult and teach on equitable urban design and sustainable development. I will be your host for this evening's adventure. I'm so excited to get started. Cue the slides. We will start by acknowledging this land and the sovereignty of the people who have lived here. I am zooming in from Lenape, Nyack, and Canarsie land, also known as Brooklyn, New York. Please use this link in the chat to identify the native lands where you live. Brooklyn. Tell us where you are zooming in from and one small thing that brings you joy these days. Once again, please use the link in the chat to identify the native lands where you live. Tell us where you are zooming in from and one small thing that brings you joy these days. One thing that brings me joy is celebrating Black excellence, and I am so full of joy this evening. Next slide. So for a little housekeeping duties, live captioning is available by clicking on the CC Live transcript button and clicking Show Transcript. Please keep in mind that we are recording this program. If you do not want to be recorded, you may keep your cameras turned off. Use the chat to share thoughts, questions, comments, or to request technical assistance. Staff will ensure that these get to the moderator, me, during Q&A. Next slide. We believe in the power of art to be the catalyst for conversation and potentially deep emotion or response. Please take a moment to scroll through the screen of faces. That's right. Go to the view, go to gallery view up there, go to gallery view, screen and screen through the faces, the amazing faces, and acknowledge this amazing shared space that we've created together. So beautiful. As you do that, I will share our community agreements for this event. By being here, these are what we agree to. We will join in and use our voice and step back to make space for the voice of others. We acknowledge the courage of each of us to speak. We will speak from our own perspective using I language. We will listen to others with care, compassion, and attention. We will acknowledge harmful or offensive language, whether intentional or unintentional, and use it as a learning opportunity. We will not tolerate any behavior or speech that abuses others. And we will take care of ourselves and acknowledge our boundaries and know when we need to step away. Thank you. Next slide. Again, welcome to all of you, the audience, in the audience. Here's our agenda for the evening. After I introduce BlackSpace and the panelists, we will dive into a creative tensions workshop exercise together with 3 prompts focused on the BlackSpace manifesto principles of reckoning with the past to build the future, centering the lived experience, and manifesting the future. There will be moments for audience Q&A throughout the event, sprinkled here and there, and another opportunity at the end for additional questions. Again, please do use the chat for questions. We will end with gratitude and closing thoughts. Next slide. So, in case if you didn't know about the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective, I'll tell you about it. We are a nonprofit organization and national network of Black urbanists, architects, artists, planners, and creatives, striving for equity and justice in the built environment, and to protect and create Black spatial futures. Our vision is that we demand a present and future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive. We exist to subvert scarcity-fueled design and urban planning interventions that perpetuate harm in Black communities and stifle Black urbanists. We operate from the perspective that articulating and funding existing assets of Black neighborhoods and urbanist circles can unearth innovative change. The BlackSpace Manifesto is our 14 core principles that guide our practice to change and to produce spaces and tools for justice-oriented design practice centered around Black life. Well, what we do is very important. The way that we do it is critical. Acknowledging our triumphs, oppressions, aspirations, and challenges, we've created this manifesto to shape our growth as a group and our interactions with one another, partners, and communities. This manifesto is also a tool for practitioners working in, with, and for Black communities to center community voice. In the past year, our affiliates in diverse cities across the country have held historic Black neighborhood walking tours, hosted large symposia on Black storytelling as placemaking, and helped save the historic Brockway Center where Black women organized for a century. There are 4 pillars of work: neighborhood strategies, customized learning, urbanist experiences, and published content. We co-created spaces to acknowledge, affirm, and amplify Black presence in public life. Please check out blackspace.org for more information and to download our BlackSpace Manifesto. Okay, will the panelists please step up onto our virtual stage? Welcome. Today, I am so honored to welcome and be welcomed by an esteemed panel, including Sekou Cooke, Yolande Daniels, Mario Gooden, Felecia Davis, Justin Moore, and Peggy Shepard. For the audience, we will post their bios into the chat for more information on each panelist. Welcome, panelists, welcome. I want to elevate an important principle of the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective: celebrate, catalyze, and amplify Black joy. Black joy is a radical act. Give due space to joy, laughter, humor, and gratitude. I will ask each of you to please share in 1 to 2 sentences who you are and how you are celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and/or work. Starting with you, Mario. How are you celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and/or work?
Thanks, Ifeoma. Yes, I'm Mario Gooden, founding principal of Huff and Gooden Architects, based in New York, and a professor of practice at Columbia University. For me, Black joy is about, I would say, 3 things. It's about resistance, refusal, and liberation. It's about resisting the forces of oppression that Black people encounter every day. It's about refusing to be defined by those forces, refusing to be defined as other, refusing to be defined as abject, and it's about liberation in the creative process. Black creative production is on fire, and it's been on fire for a while. And nothing brings me more joy than the intersection of the intellectual, the creative, and the material. And so the opportunity to design, for me, architecture, to build architecture, but also to build community is what gives me joy and what sustains me.
Awesome. That is so wonderful. What an amazing launchpad for this discussion. Thank you so much. Peggy, we'll move on to you. Please share with us 1 to 2 sentences on who you are and how you are celebrating and catalyzing and amplifying Black joy in your life and or work.
Well, I co-founded an organization in Harlem to fight environmental racism and achieve environmental justice. And I tell the stories of victory, commitment, and achievement of Black communities around this country so that we understand that we can prevail, we can work together, and we can overcome. And we can create sustainable, healthy communities for all our families.
I love it. Thank you. We appreciate you. Thank you for joining us today. I'll move on to you, Sekou. Who are you and how are you celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and or work? Sekou, you're muted.
Hi, finally. So who I am is a very tough question, probably the tougher of the 2 questions. I am transforming and growing each day into the person I want to be, I guess. Right now, I practice architecture in Syracuse, New York, and I'm transitioning into a new position at UNC in Charlotte, where I'll be directing their massive urban design program. And the joy for me is in the work. I mentioned this in a BRC event last week, and just putting one foot in front of the other and looking at what's next and thinking about what's ahead of me is what brings me constant joy. Feeling the love and appreciation and support from everyone through all these transitions has been wonderful as well. But creating everything I do in the built environment, the things that I write about, the things that I lecture about, the things that I build and imagine, each of these things brings are tools that I use to bring a greater sense of joy wherever I go.
Awesome. Thank you so much and congratulations.
Thank you.
Next, Yolande, please share for us who you are and how you are celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and or work.
Thank you, Ifeoma. I am Yolande Daniels. I'm an associate professor of architecture at USC, actually for 2 weeks now. So like Sekou, I'm in transition too. And let's see, I have an architectural practice, Studio Sumo in New York. And my research related to the project that's on exhibition at MoMA is looking at, on the one hand, dynamics of Black settlement in cities and the relationship between power and placemaking as it affects Black people and Black settlements. And then on the other hand, looking at Black settlements themselves kind of from the inside out. So the actions of African Americans to make places that support themselves. And I think of Black joy in terms of in metaphysical terms, actually. And it's something that has to do with the spirit. I think it's everything that's been said so far, but it's a combination of the spirit and this kind of triumph of like the will of people to persevere and to kind of have an imprint on society. And so I see that in my work, and it gives me great joy to do this work, actually, to find spaces of agency, however small or large, that have been created by our ancestors.
I love it. That's powerful. This is so inspiring. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being here today. Next, Justin, please share with us who you are and how you are celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and or work.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I'm joining you from Kigali, Rwanda, and I have many different hats in my work, so it's hard to say kind of who I am in one piece, but the short version is that I'm a person that cares about people, places, and the planet, and everything that is great and wonderful about all three of those things that need to be protected and promoted in my multiple hats and roles, including also as a founding member of BlackSpace. For catalyzing Black joy, I like to say that I love it when Black people can be proud and authentic in public. And I underline in public because it's something that hasn't always been possible. And in my work, I've really tried in every mode and measure possible to find ways to make it so that we can experience Black joy in public, not only Black people, but that all of us can experience Black joy in public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's radical. It's a beautiful sight. Thank you for sharing. And last but not least, Felecia, please share with us who you are and how you are celebrating, catalyzing, and amplifying Black joy in your life and or work.
Hello all, and greetings from the lands that sustain the Susquehannock and Lenape peoples in Pennsylvania at Penn State University. I'm an associate professor at Penn State in the Department of Architecture, and I'm also director of Soft Lab, where we look at using computational soft materials to communicate with people through architecture and other things. So what brings joy? I would say really what brings joy is making work, something that I can share with others and inspire others, inspire the next generation of architects and designers coming up behind me, and making work that comes from a place that I connect with as a Black woman and my students connect with as people of color. So I find it so important to find a way to ensure that students and others understand that places that maybe aren't necessarily seen as traditional architecture are valued and can be brought into architecture and innovated into architecture. So really joy comes from finding and forging that path, and that journey and that path making is making a home.
Wonderful. I love it. I'm so full. I'm so full. We haven't even just really begun. Thank you all for sharing those wonderful words. Awesome. So let's cue the Creative Tensions Jamboard. We're going to have a little game show here. So everyone sees their Jamboard, right? Okay, awesome. So derived by a model created by CoLab and remixed by the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective, the BlackSpace Creative Tensions exercise will allow us to engage in conversation centering cities, its people, and spatial justice. Next. So click to the next Jamboard. Okay, thank you. Each creative tension prompt centers principles of the BlackSpace Manifesto that I mentioned earlier. Next. Creative Tensions is a literal moving conversation. Our panelists and the audience will be prompted to reflect on a tension between two poles and reveal where you stand on an issue. Next. As you see in this warm-up, there are 2 polls and Post-it notes with them with names on them. Panelists will use the Post-it notes to drag their name to the poll of choice. The audience also be able to chime into this conversation with a live poll that you'll respond to. It'll pop up in front of you. This will be a dynamic experience for all of us to co-create truth and knowledge. All right, let's get started. Next. The first principle, reckon with the past to build the future. In this principle, we encourage people to meaningfully acknowledge the histories, injustice, innovations, and victories of spaces and places before new work begins. Reckon with the past as a means of healing, building trust, and deepening understanding of self and others. Next. All right, guys, here's your prompt. When thinking about historic preservation, it is more important to preserve structures or to preserve culture. Panelists, please use the Post-it note with your name to lock in your choice. Audience, you will see a poll pop up where you can chime into this conversation. Feel free, audience, feel free to add questions or additional comments about your answer in the chat. So, panelists, I see you shifting your Post-it notes all around. Yolande, Peggy, are you set? Are you locked in already? Oh, I see Yolande is shifting. I see. Okay, Peggy, I see you're in the game. You're shifting. Oh, is everybody finished? Felecia, have you locked in your answer? Are you locked in? Everybody's on. It seems like everybody's on one side of the poll. So nobody believes in preserving structures as important. Okay. All right, audience. The audience is still chiming in to the poll. Wonderful. So I see Sekou, you positioned your Post-it note all the way right. So can you share a little bit about when thinking about historic preservation, is it more important? Why is it more important to preserve culture and not preserve structures? Architect, so please give me some insight. You're muted.
Thank you. Just waiting for the opportunity to unmute. Someone's a little slow on the trigger there. So yeah, I think I'm on this side, definitely not all the way to the right. I maybe everyone else kind of hedged their bets a little bit on the edge. But I think, you know, to me, preserving culture is part of preserving a structure, right? So that the culture is the thing that is most important, and that the structure itself is a vessel only for preserving that culture. So it's not about the structure itself that gets that takes the lead, though the structure becomes preserved as a kind of byproduct of preserving the culture. And in the work that I do, this is something that I really harp on over and over, that that architecture is essentially a vessel for reflecting our cultural identities and our cultural values. And there's been this massive force in academic circles of architecture that has tried to strip away individual identity and different types of cultures away from the architectural product, and which leaves us with a landscape that reflects only a singular dominant idea of what culture means, and that always defaults to the European, to the Western, to the white. And the work that I do is always about amplifying all of these various cultures that we have, you know, the myriad cultures that we and ethnicities that we reflect, instead of thinking about architecture through a singular lens. So everything that I do and every way that I think about the work that I do is about preserving culture in one way or another.
So good. We have one comment in the chat that says, it depends on how you preserve the structure. Is it preserved, even changed to support the community? What are your thoughts on that, Yolande?
So is it preserved to support the community? Let's see. I think my thoughts, like the way that I positioned myself on this matrix has to do with just the way that historic preservation has been thought. And I don't think it has been, like, it hasn't really been conceived in terms of communities. It's been preserved, I think, more along the lines of what Sekou was talking about in terms of structures, like largely objects, artifacts, material, you know, forms. Landscapes are included, but material forms and objects that that kind of are part of the formation of cities, and then through cities, the formation of culture. And I don't really think community was part of that formulation. And so I think that the way that historic preservation has been conceived has changed. So now there's the idea of historic conservation or conservation preservation. So it's more about, I think, communities. It's perhaps less about objects, but I feel like the terms are still too weighted toward objects and not toward communities, actually. And in the work that I do, like so often, there aren't artifacts for the history of minorities, for people who are in subordinate positions. There aren't artifacts. And so therefore there has not been a quote unquote history for them. And I think that's why I think maybe the terms have to be different, because we need to be able to relate histories for communities, but also histories when objects are lacking.
So good. Thank you for sharing that. Really wonderful comments. You know, we have another comment in the chat where someone says, but structures reflect bodies. When structures don't exist, neither do bodies or the cultures that they represent. Justin, please chime into this conversation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and putting the Post-it note in, so I kind of put my toe in structures, because I actually agree in some part that the structure can and does matter, obviously, but the reason that I also kind of lean to the preserved culture part is that I actually think the spaces are in some ways more essential to the bodies than the structure. And the reason for that is that structures are ephemeral in some form. Even our most solid and stead sort of implementations on the planet are still ephemeral when you look at time in a different way, but the spaces somehow have ways to persist, and spaces have been activated by bodies. And you know, we all know this in spaces of loss. Frankly, this summer during the protests, there were all the Black Lives Matter murals that went in all over the country, and some of those were marking spaces of loss that maybe there were once structures, but those spaces did not lose their meaning as places that were important to Black people and Black culture, for example. And that's not a Black people thing, that's a human thing, that our places and our spaces matter. And structures in a way are kind of appurtenances to that. And someone mentioned in the chat, right, in other cultures, it may be that a place may be rebuilt actually as a form of preservation, and not making sacred the material or the old, but making sacred what happens in that space, or what's the reflection of that space. So I think it's an important kind of distinction, especially when you talk about our bodies, that we sort of see and value the spaces as much as structure, and that those get animated and activated by culture, and frankly by difference and by the multitude.
That's so good. You know, I've also felt torn on this in this poll, because my family is Nigerian, and traditional Nigerian architecture is very important. It's integrated. It's a part of the culture. And so to preserve culture, to preserve structure, is to preserve the culture. It is to sort of capture a moment in history. So it's a very interesting poll there. Peggy, I see that you have your Post-it note landed on the to preserve culture side. What are your thoughts, particularly in the context of this conversation on environmental justice?
Yeah, I believe that buildings really preserve an aura and a vision of the past that can be very physical. But because structures, houses, statues can be torn down and can wither away through generations, I believe that culture is really alive through imagination and evolves through literature and art. And I think that's the importance of literature and art, because it really culture continues through words, through song, and through deed.
That's so good. So there are many ways to preserve culture, multiple ways beyond the structure. I think that's so powerful. Thank you. Mario, I see you're sort of at the top of the arrow there. What are your thoughts? And you also have a sort of a big toe inside the structures area too.
Yes, I really do agree with my colleagues thus far. I would, however, I would add that you know, preservationists use the term assets to refer to buildings and historic fabric, and that word in itself raises a question about value. And so often, particularly in the United States, structures or buildings built by and for African Americans are not seen as having value, or seen as vernacular, so not seen as capital A architecture. When those structures have been preserved, so for example, I practiced in Charleston, South Carolina for a number of years, and was involved with preservation projects there. And when those structures, let's say slave cabins, were preserved, they were there to support the dominant narrative, not necessarily to tell the other side of the story. That is now beginning to change, you know, in recent years, in terms of some of the tours of plantations and what have you, and learning more about the lives of the enslaved people there. But still predominantly, architecture and the preservation of architecture has been about preserving the dominant narrative, or preserving the dominant culture. So that's why I have one toe, or one big toe, on the structure side, but really I think it's important that the preservation of the structure of the architecture is really about telling the story of what happened here, and preserving the stories about and the culture about the people.
Yeah, so good. And Felecia, you please chime in. Like, where are you sitting after hearing from the rest of the panelists, and just like, what do you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I would say I agree with most of the comments thus far. I think that I saw a comment go by way at the top of this question or this poll that said, maybe these aren't a dichotomy, maybe it's not a pole that we're actually talking about. In fact, it might be something more entangled. And I really agree with this idea that, you know, we are all entangled buildings, structures, landscapes. And so that when we talk about culture, we're not really talking about something that separates things out as either this or that, but things that are interpenetrated and interconnected. And so if you want to talk about or understand social justice, it's to understand holistically the relationships between all these things, right? And so when you talk about stories, it's kind of interconnecting of maybe pieces that seem like they don't belong together or even exist in the same space, but in fact they do. And so I like to think about this question as more of a question of entanglement. How are things entangled, and how might they be connected, and how is it kind of, you know, something that is seemingly unrelated all of a sudden is, you know, right in your face and absolutely connected to the way in which you live your life or the way in which your children will live their lives. I think one of my sort of favorite things that I read this summer, one of my favorite books was The Yellow House by Sarah Bloom. And she talks about this house that is in New Orleans, and the house gets washed away in Katrina, but the family comes back and they tell their stories and they rebuild it. And they, I think this book captures this question of preservation, that, you know, this idea of a landscape kind of embodying something larger than ourselves, but represents a culture, right? And a kind of writ large, interconnected with nature. So anyway, I love that book. It's called The Yellow House by Sarah Bloom. I'm not here to sell her book, but I loved her book.
Thank you for sharing that. Entangled spatial narratives. I love that. I feel like I'm going to use that somewhere in a class I teach or something. Thank you for that. There's so many wonderful quotes that we've captured from each of you in the chat. And so we want to open up and see what the results of the poll is. Okay, wow. It looks like the audience really shares your sentiments in terms of preserving culture. 91% of the audience, and we have close to 500 people in the audience, 91% felt that preserving culture, when thinking about historic preservation, it's more important. But I do agree with this notion. I mean, I feel like a lot of the feedback that we're seeing in the chat is that people agree with this idea that the two are entangled, that there's a connection between the two. It's hard to separate the two. Maya, could you please give us a sense of, are there any, what kind of questions do people have in the chat? So audience, please head to the chat, put in some questions or comments that you want to pose to the panelists, and let's have a conversation here.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so we've gotten some really great questions. Thank you, everyone who participated. So I'm just going to read a few aloud. So one of the great questions we have is, someone commented, can't stop thinking about Yolande's point. How can you preserve what's not even known or valued? How can we preserve the ephemeral? And then calling out another question, you've got a comment from Jeff that says, to what degree is the structure-culture nexus a reiteration of the question? What is a church? A place where people meet, a physical structure, or a gathering of people? So what's the community, the life of the culture like? So, and we also have another great question just about what does preserving culture look like in a culturally diverse place?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thoughts, comments? For me, yeah.
Yeah, I think those are all fascinating questions that are getting, especially the last one, getting me to think more about the reality of what's being preserved. And it goes to one of Justin's comments in the chat about, and Mario's comment about what is an asset, right? What is valued? And then who the arbiters of that are, right? The historical preservation community or societies actually have a whole process where they deem something historically significant and something else not historically significant. So, but that is, you know, we have to look at the makeup of those boards, who are making those decisions and what are their like life experiences and cultural biases. And the type of things that Yolande is talking about, these histories that are primarily oral, that might get lost in some of those processes, might not have the same kind of sense of value, or you know, the way that people occupy and inhabit a space has a new cultural overlay that might not be the same thing that people understand what that means. So, you know, one might look at a regular single family house stoop in South Central California and think it has zero value, but somebody else might look at it and say that was the steps where, you know, where Chris Tucker and Ice Cube filmed Friday, and, you know, Debo stole this guy's bike, right? So that has a kind of cultural value that people might deserve to be preserved just as much as a detail that connects back to some historical lineage from Greece or something, right? So who is making the decisions about what is valued is incredibly important in this conversation.
Great point. Who has control of that narrative? Who is determining what is considered of value? That's very central to this conversation. Mia, are there other questions? What were the other questions?
We got a few more. So Ronnie was asking about how buildings and how they affect things and how they can create culture. And Gerard was also asking about who can actually determine, who should determine what is preserved and who gets to decide these things.
I think you definitely spoke to that second point, but I think there was another question that spoke about churches and whether the church is about the building, the structure itself, or whether it's about the people. And I think that's a really great point, particularly myself going to a Black church, and, you know, the conversation is always like, you know, is it about the space, or is it about the community that you form in that space? And when that space is no longer there, especially now in this context of, you know, quarantine life, how do you continue to continue that sense of community if you're no longer going and navigating to a physical place? So your idea of community changes and transforms. It's now virtual. And so what does that mean for the value that we put on a physical structures? Justin, please chime in.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to this question because it talks about process in a way. So the process of change is ultimately what we're all talking about. You know, what do you get to keep and what do you not get to keep, and what do you get to build, right? These sort of kind of triangular questions that a lot of communities and a lot of places are asked to deal with. And this question about what do we get to keep is something that I think needs to be a more rooted conversation in design and architecture and and in urbanism. And I say that because when we talk about questions of labor, questions of that Mario was raising about value, that there's sort of a misalignment, I think, in many places about that, and thinking about it as a process that can be done in a way that is more kind of thoughtful and grounded, right? So our systems are sort of made up to value some things and not others, and therefore we may maintain places in an unequal way. And so, you know, an old white church might get maintained in a certain way, and an old Black church may not, right? All Black people know about the elevator fund, right? And the idea of kind of how we invest in maintaining spaces needs to be a part of that conversation, right? So not simply do you save something when it's almost lost, but what kind of resources and value and participation are in place to sort of keep places. The other dimension of that is to talk about kind of complexity, right? So communities change, people change, there are generational shifts, there are economic shifts, potentially environmental shifts. New Orleans was just mentioned, and understanding the process that it takes to sort of design for that, and to think about that, and to imagine what change looks like in a way that is meaningful and connected for people is something that I think all of our fields need to do, but at an almost ethical level in communities that we know have not seen privilege and not seen power in the way that they are deserving. We have to be even more careful, I think, about understanding what the process for change looks like and who it involves and who gets to make the decisions.
Really good. Thank you. Mario, please chime in, because that actual question about who gets to be involved and whose voice is centered in making those decisions, we'll definitely jump into on the next creative tension. But Mario, please chime in before we shift.
Sure, thank you, Ifeoma. I wanted to circle back to the question about space and also the question about landscape, because we've been concentrating and speaking about the structure or buildings, but the fact is that before Black people in this country even could build their own churches, they went out into the landscape, into the swamp or into the forest, and actually made space by making a clearing and constructing what was called a hush arbor or bush arbor. So this was space in the landscape, and this was about constructing space and community. And our colleague Walter Hood has edited an important volume called Black Landscapes Matter. And I think so often it's missed upon the general public, I suppose, the relationship that I think particularly Black people in this country really have with the landscape and with understanding nature, understanding the landscape, and understanding how to make space without, let's say, structure or without the nature of building. And so I think that's very, very important that when we think of preservation, we're not only thinking about preserving the structure, but we're also thinking about landscape and what happened in that landscape.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, there seems to be many comments in the chat where people definitely identify and agree with you. And someone has shared a link to Walter Hood's Black Landscape Matter. Thank you. So we are going to shift to the next creative tension. Next slide, thank you. Center the lived experience. In this principle, we acknowledge that lived experience is an important expertise. Center it so it can be a guide and touchstone of all work. Panelists, please, next slide. Panelists, please use the Post-it notes. with your name to lock in your choice. When creating space for more inclusion in your community, designers/architects should create a consensus with community leaders or ensure that all community has contributed to the process. Audience, you will see a pop-up where you can chime into this conversation. Feel free to add questions or additional comments about your answer in the chat. Now let's co-create this conversation together. Again, when creating space for more inclusion in your community, designers/architects should either or create a consensus with community leaders or ensure that all community has contributed to the process. So this is a great next conversation because it feels like that's where our conversation was heading into in terms of who has power, who has voice in this work in determining what has value, what assets have value, what structures have value, what culture, what narrative has value in a community. And this is really quite fascinating. We've got a dispersion now. It seems like you guys are not all on the same side of the pole this time. So I'm going to call on you, Peggy. It seems that you've chosen that the answer that you've chosen is ensure that all community has contributed to the process instead of create a consensus with community leaders. Please embellish on that. I'd love to just hear from just like your experience, like why that resonates most for you.
Well, you know, if I can talk about some actual projects and initiatives, when I go back to the Black Manifesto, I think about centering lived experience and seeking people at the margins. And that's really at the foundation of the environmental justice work I do. I've been one of the people who went down to the Landmarks Commission and was chained to the benches because they would not give a historic preservation certification to certain blocks in Harlem. We've got a real dilemma in Harlem with so much of the Black church deciding that it's okay to sell the air rights, tear down the church, and get a new modern facility developed by some developer who wants to build on that site. And so there is that discussion between who has voice in this. And if it's simply community leaders, and generally community leaders often means the VIPs and the political leaders, it's often people who are at the margins who really understand and feel the pull of culture. It's not as intellectual and theoretical to them. It's a feeling for them. It's being at home. And I remember just down the street from me, when the Alexander Hamilton Grange was going to be moved from Convent Avenue to the St. Nicholas Park. I believe that it should have been moved, yet I had people who grew up in that neighborhood who talked about the passion of walking past that every day since they had lived in the community, since they were a child, and what it meant to them to have that structure in that place. And I kind of never forgot that situation. It seems like a tempest in a teapot, but it was something that the West Harlem community was very passionate about. And I never forgot the people who grew up in those areas who felt how important it was for them to maintain it in that space, even though the structure was only going to be moved a couple of blocks away. So again, I think we need to hear from the entire community as much as we can, because we've got to center those voices and center that lived experience.
That's so good. You know, there's one comment in the chat that says, it might be interesting to think about consent versus consensus? And do we only have consents when we, only focus on one group as opposed to really making sure we're reaching a broad a group of people? Really, really interesting points to bring up. Sekou, I see that you're on you're more towards the other end of the spectrum. Please give us a sense of what you're thinking here.
There we go. So yeah, I'm kind of right on the edge, and I'll say two things about that. There is a customary process of community engagement that is really going into these community meetings and talking to as many people as you possibly can, and getting a sense of just making sure that they have participated in the process. Usually that's a bit of a check in the box, and the processes don't always result in everyone really being engaged and really having a say. And it also has the potential to be so dispersed that very little actually moves forward. The way that I've worked is really going to people who have formed consensuses themselves within the community. They are empowered by the community to start to make some of these larger collective decisions. Some of them may not be really acting in the best interest of everyone, but they have been empowered to move a process forward. That being said, I put this whole thing upside down because the way that I am proposing to work with communities that I'm promoting in my book, Hip Hop Architecture, that's coming out next month, is more about turning that entire process upside down. Instead of us thinking about how we are going to work with the communities, can we empower the communities to do this work themselves? How are we giving them tools and frameworks where they can actually express the real needs or their real creativity, and really transform the process from top down to bottom up, right?
So good. And so we're sort of shifting from like an engagement process more and more into sort of co-creation. Like, how are you, through your work, creating a framework or tools or capacity for people to do on their own?
Exactly, because architects have been so reticent to really relinquish that power and authority to actually shape these environments. And we have to really get over ourselves and give a lot of that space up, and trust that people really know how to build their own communities, and that they're not as uneducated or creative or incapable as our profession makes us think.
That's brilliant. And just get out the way. One of the BlackSpace Manifesto principles is to be humble learners who practice deep listening. And so we are, practitioners, or we have a technical expertise. But often, I think the way we're trained at times, we're trained to sort of have this sort of like dominant perspective on things where we know the right answers, we know how things should be done. But we actually need to take a step back and really listen and learn, offer our expertise when desired, and help shape and form a project, but not to lead the charge. It really should be centered on the people that live there and have the lived experience. One post here in the chat, someone says, the design of the process is of the utmost importance because participation can be hard to measure, but it's very important. And that's so true. I'd love to hear from you, Yolande, and where you sit on this. I see you sort of like up and sort of more towards the middle.
Yes. So I think for me, I don't know, the thought that I have in my head is about just the way that there are, related to the last question and to this question, is just whether it's top down or thinking about who controls narratives, that there's the way that things operate right now. The reason why architects might be called to step back is because the way that we have been taught to approach things is through narratives of power, narratives of dominance. And I think that we need to be able to accommodate multiple narratives, right? Because right now, the only way that we have of operating is that there's a historical narrative, it's the narrative of dominance, and then the other narratives are suppressed, right? So then there's the question of if you let all the narratives rise to the surface, you know, how could you possibly let that happen? It would just be chaos, right? And I think that's where we are now. Like, that's kind of the question that we need to be asking. You know, how can we value multiple peoples, multiple positions, multiple histories at the same time equally? How can we recognize multiple histories? And so for me, the question about the community and consensus is related to that question, because we have to value multiple voices. So it's not just about the experts, because that's part of the narrative of dominance mentality, and we need other, you know, a different mentality. So I think what Sekou was saying is part of trying to think about, you know, turning it on its end, another way of, you know, valuing people, spaces, places, stories. But I think there are more approaches. I think we're really tasked now to find more approaches.
Absolutely. And I think also, just as an educator among many of you, it's also just, how do we integrate that into the academic environment? How do we share that wisdom and knowledge to students who are learning architecture, who are learning planning, urban design, on ways to co-create with community? Because that's so different. I wasn't taught that way. I had to sort of grow that with experience. But, you know, how do we teach architecture and planning? Well, planning, I think, to be debated, but I think how to teach architecture in a way that really encourages people to facilitate the process and be those humble listeners. Because as you mentioned, we are really trained to be sort of the power players and be the dominant voice in a conversation.
I think the word co-creation is really important, what you said.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Justin, please chime in here. Yeah. Well, while you're waiting, there's one comment in the chat where someone says, we have an interesting situation in Chicago in which a community that is racially homogeneous but falls along different class and status lines are in dispute about consensus about how culture should be preserved in their shared neighborhood. Really interesting. Justin, please weigh in here.
Yeah, kind of back on the previous point before speaking to that, why I kind of located myself where I did is that I think that in the US and definitely in the profession, we have a really problematic relationship with the idea or identity of leader and leadership, and that it has a certain structure and presence that is problematic and frankly even harmful. You know, we just saw with our last 4 years of presidency, like a really extreme version of that. But the idea that somehow sort of power, agency, or knowledge gets concentrated into one magical person or a few magical people is something to really be challenged. And as our society and our kind of interactions and communication methods have become more sophisticated and distributed and networked, I think our ideas of leadership need to be pushed. And something I actually really appreciate about this Reconstruction show and all of the architects and designers and artists involved in the show is that it seems to be an active and willful pushback against that narrative of the individual mind or leader or creative energy, and that there is a simultaneous investment in something that is collective and distributed, and bringing the ability to frankly operate in a different way that is not about sort of being the one, right? And this idea of the one is not to the multitude's benefit. And so that's, that happens in community processes, whether it's a neighborhood planning process or a conversation about a local school. We see it in many different ways. And so to kind of the point that was made in the chat about these kind of differing voices, right? We have kind of dueling leadership or dueling narratives that happen. And this is where the hard work of complexity and compromise comes into play, and what leadership looks like. It used to, I think, involve more complexity and compromise. And it seems like in our society and for a lot of different reasons, that's been challenged, that it looks like something else, which is more driven and kind of my way or highway. Something I'll mention is that absolutely co-creation, cooperation, compromise, all these things are important. But I do think that there's a different conversation about not engagement, or what people call community engagement, or even participation, but really about sort of a collective valuing of just being together. And I think so much is underlying in some of these questions that you're putting forward is asking us sort of a broader question, which is, how are we going to be together? Mm-hmm. What does that look like? How do we make that happen? And knowing and accepting that it's hard. And that's in the smallest of communities, like, talk to your family, right? Or talk to your, your extended family or your best friends or your partner. And it's hard, but I think, what leadership looks like, what participation looks like, what power looks like in those dynamics is something that we can challenge and push.
So good. And I just feel like what that brings up for me is just this idea of collective dreaming or imagination, and creating space for that. And particularly in the Black community, how challenging that can be for people who have been weighed down with trauma and injustice and oppression. And so what does that look like to create that space, to open up that space for imagination, for co-creation to happen, that's not weighed down, that is liberated? Mario, in your book, Dark Space, you say liberation is a spatial act. I love that quote. I use it everywhere. I'd love for you to weigh into this conversation.
Okay, there we go. Thanks again, Ifeoma. Yes, I mean, I when I wrote, liberation is a spatial practice, it's very much, in line with some of what's been said here this evening in terms of thinking about agency, and that, radical actions of liberation have always been about understanding and even subverting power within spatial conditions. And I think that co-creation, in terms of working with communities, is about collective engagement and the potential, if you will, for to develop a kind of spatial practice and understanding of the community, whereby, as I was taught, and as so many of us were taught, the architect goes in and really just kind of extracts. So how do we extract information and then comes back and says, okay, here's a design. But how do we enable or activate or lend agency in a way in which, yes, people can imagine, or communities, let me put it that way, communities can imagine, communities can dream, communities can take it upon themselves to make space, even in the smallest actions. So I really do appreciate this, the comments about co-creation. And I think someone also said in the chat that perhaps we also have to think about, and I'm looking back to see if I can find it, maybe it's already scrolled up too far. We have to think about co-responsibility. We have to also think about co-liability. And I thought that comment, still looking for it here. Hopefully I didn't mangle it up. Maybe someone can put it back in the chat. I thought that was really, really insightful.
Yeah, co-liability and co-responsibility. I love it. Absolutely. Because that leads to co-creation may need to translate into co-liability, co-accountability, co-responsibility for healthy outcomes. Love it. Yeah, that's wonderful. But then that leads to co-ownership, a sense of co-ownership, partnership. Absolutely. Before we head to just like some questions from the audience, and audience, please type your questions into the chat. I'd love to just hear from Felecia, because I think your work is just really just like, it's playful in a way. You're looking at technology, you're looking at like sewing and fabrics and textiles, and that can just be such an amazing way of creating this space for imagination and wonder and dreaming in the space of architecture. And so I'd love for you to chime in on your thoughts on this conversation.
I was just going to add that in terms of this idea of co-creation, I think the language of making is really important, that when you work with a group of people, that they make their own language, right? You're sort of going back and forth and discussing things. And even though you may be speaking the same language, English, for example, at the end of the day, by coming together, you're kind of making a new world by the invention that you're constructing. And I think community design might be like that too, which is where I fall on the other side of this map, ensure that all community has contributed to the process because of this issue of language making. When you are with a group of people, and I think it's fluid and transitory, and that it takes time for the language to kind of seep throughout a kind of group of people. So these things become really important in terms of not only, small scale making something like with fabrics or the quilt or, this antenna that we made for the MoMA exhibition, but also larger scale that people have to kind of debate and argue about what it is that they value, what it is that in fact they're actually talking about, and really a new language emerges. So I do believe that all the community needs to be connected and is in fact co-constructing if they work together. So I wrote way at the top of the chat when Justin was talking, he said something about rethinking this idea of leadership. I totally agree with that, that if one really sits down to make something with people over time, that there are these things that happen over and over again that mean that one really does need to think about different models of leadership, perhaps collective, perhaps quiet leaders, perhaps leaders that listen rather than speak more. So I think that all of this becomes kind of foregrounded when you sit down and make something, and that can be applied to a larger scale.
Thank you so much. So Mia, can you give us, if there are any juicy questions or comments, questions in particular?
Yes, of course. Oh my goodness, there's so many, but one question that we just got in was, I think a really good question off of Felicia's point just now was, what does the shifting or sharing of power look like as opposed to just the consolidation of power? And what does that really look like in practice? And then we actually have so many people questioning in the chat about consensus in general. I think we had a group of questions. So people were really curious to know, how do we create consensus, especially if values don't align? And do we glorify consensus even as a general value over the actual negotiation, conflict, and power relations in community? So we've got some really good jumping off points. And then lastly, we had a great question from Cassandra about technology, asking if any ideas on how technology factors into this conversation, exacerbating socioeconomic divisions and allowing for conversations to reach new audiences, and somewhere along that pendulum. And it would be really great to hear Felicia's thoughts here. So that's what we've got as a jumping off point.
Felecia, you want to chime in?
I will unmute myself. Yeah, so in terms of technology, technology can both hurt and help, right? Depending on how it's used. I think it's humans making the technology, so embedded into that are human biases and the ways of thinking about race, right, and space. So these things become embedded in the things that in the technologies that we use. And so really one has to sort of look at, like with every instance, usually technology is far ahead of the ways in which people might think about some repercussions of what is happening with that technology. And so now I think that, we're at a point where, time needs to be given to think through how these technologies might best be engaged in ways in which they might be connected with people who want to use them. And I also think that they're, a point of amazing creativity, right? People can do some incredible things, but the connection with technology, I think for me, is potentially one of the most important things, but it has this other dangerous side that we all have to watch out for.
Thank you so much for sharing. Can we please? No, yeah, go ahead, Sekou.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in about technology because it's a subject that I'm pretty fascinated by as well, and I've been writing about and thinking about doing a lot more work in the area of hip hop architectural technology, and I think of the ways that we can actually hack technology or misuse technology or misappropriate technology, because that is the kind of ingenuity that really gave us hip hop culture, right? Or gave us hip hop music, at least. If we were just simple consumers and put a record on a turntable and listen to the music that came out of it, then we're we're benefiting from technology, but not a technology that we've created. Once we put our fingers on that record and start to use it as an instrument instead of as a passive consumption technology, now we're creating something new. And so I'm really fascinated by how we take that attitude and apply it to all the different technologies that we interface with on a daily basis, especially technologies that produce architecture. You know, there's a great book edited by Rod Eglash called about, you know, hacking technologies and different approaches to technologies. And he talks about how, you know, the film, the way that film was originally conceived of was to prioritize pale skin, right? And so Black skin wasn't really considered in for original Kodak film. And then there's other technology, like there was the story a few years back about these racist, you know, racist automatic hand washers that wouldn't recognize Black skin. You know, if the skin were too dark, then it wouldn't turn on. So we have to, that just reinforces our need to not take this passive approach to technology. There's a lot of work being done for people creating and putting Black people on the side of creating and inventing new technologies, but we've always been inventing. And we have to shift this dynamic from consuming technology to something that we have to take a whole new approach to.
So good. Thank you for sharing that. And I just love the direction of this conversation around the use of technology, and, you know, also how it can expand opportunities for us to be able to reach a broader group of people in any process, you know, to allow multiple people to chime in and contribute and get access to decision making. I want to shift to our slide 12. If you can shift to slide 12, and while we do that, if we can also share what the audience poll was for this question. Okay, it looks like the audience, 86%, felt that ensure that all community has contributed to the process was more important than creating consensus with community leaders. And I think, you know, we've sort of talked about the dynamics of both of those. And I want to thank you so much for this conversation. And I want to bring Adelia Greg, before we have before we close on Promote Excellence, I want to invite Adelia Gregory from MoMA to give some thoughts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adelia Gregory, and I wish we had more time. I thought, anyway, it is my honor to share just a few words of gratitude before Ifeoma leads us through the closing moments of tonight's gathering. And just like to say, on behalf of the programming team here at MoMA, we just are thankful to our speakers tonight for their presence, for their words, for their recommendations, for their good, beautiful, and complicated questions. Sekou Cooke, Yolande Daniels, Mario Gooden, Peggy Shepard, Justin Garrett Moore, and Felecia Davis, thank you. To Ifeoma Ebo and the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective, so grateful for your humor, your enthusiasm, your agreement to moderate and host tonight's discussion in the spirit of joy and collaboration, and music that you brought to us tonight, which we will get to also soon. And I actually want to echo what Ifeoma said at the beginning and thank every single person every single human that showed up tonight. We are here now. We are 341 strong. And I invite you, before we close, to take a moment and scroll through again and just take note of the faces, the names, the phone numbers, whether you have your screen on or off tonight. We're here in this space. We're in Zoom, but we are gathered today collectively, and we just really appreciate it. The programming team is always learning from you. And we are going to drop a survey in the chat. We're going to send you an email with some of the resources, ideas that have been shared by the panelists and Ifeoma here tonight. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. And Ifeoma, I'm really looking forward to our closing moments and what you have planned. So I pass it back to you with gratitude.
Thank you. So let's close in a space of gratitude and aspiration. Promote excellence. This is the BlackSpace Manifesto Principle. We can put the we can put the slide back up if you want. But in this principle, we encourage all to amplify, elevate, and love Black vanguards, all of you, and the variety of their challenging, creative, exceptional, and innovative work and spaces. All of you, Black vanguards, Sekou, Yolande, Mario, Peggy, Justin, Felecia. Allow excellence to build influence that creates opportunities for present and future generations. So audience, please share in the chat one word that demonstrates how you will promote excellence in your life moving forward. Once again, audience, please share in the chat one word that demonstrates how you will promote excellence in your life moving forward. Panelists, I will ask the same to you, starting with you, Peggy. How will you promote excellence moving forward? You're muted. We need to hear your voice. Everyone unmute so you can be ready.
I will pursue that through being a catalyst, through catalyzing.
Awesome, being a catalyst. We love it. We love it. Justin, please, what is your one word? How will you promote excellence moving forward?
Tenacity, do it all the time.
You said tenacity?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, you are tenacious. Thank you so much. Felecia, please, one word, how will you promote excellence moving forward?
To inspire.
Inspire, absolutely, absolutely. You have been an inspiration for me as a professor of mine while I was in architecture school, so thank you for sharing and being here. Mario, please chime in. How will you promote excellence moving forward in one word?
Transformation.
Absolutely, transformation. Thank you so much. You have been through your written work and through your academic work and through your practice, so thank you. Yolande, please share, how will you promote excellence moving forward?
Through spirit, making opportunities for people to engage spiritually. So
Okay.
promoting soul.
Promoting soul, yes, I love it. To the heart of us, absolutely, we need it. We need it. Thank you so much. And Sekou, last but not least, how will you promote excellence moving forward?
Through fearlessness, unrelenting fearlessness.
Oh, absolutely. Unrelenting fearlessness. Absolutely. For all of us. Yes. What an amazing evening. Thank you to the wonderful panelists, Felecia, Sekou, Mario, Peggy, Yolande, Justin, for sharing and enriching us with your wisdom and insight. Thank you to all of you, the audience, for sharing this space of collective growth and for co-creating this experience together. May we forever be changed. And last but not least, thank you, MoMA, for creating this space in partnership with the BlackSpace Urbanist Collective. I want to end with a quote by the prolific science fiction writer, Octavia Butler. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Thank you again, and good night.